Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Our talk is entitled Black Sheep and Sacred Cows, Literary Translation in Post-Soviet Russia, but necessarily we'll indeed have to delve into the history of translation in Soviet Russia and the often uneasy connections between our Soviet legacy and what's happening today. This symbolizes the idea. When people speak about the current situation with literary translation in Russia, they're usually complaining. And the complaints are twofold. There are two main problems or grievances that people like to express. One of them is that everything was very good in Soviet times. The quality of translation was excellent. It was very high. And now it's abysmal. And so we've lost, or some even say betrayed, an honorable and wonderful tradition. Another complaint, which comes more from the professional circles, is that it used to be a normal, reasonably paid profession. And now it isn't. Of course, these two things are connected, aren't they? The average fee for literary translation in modern Russia is up to £100 for what is called authorский list, which is about 22 pages, and in words that's about 6,500 words. Which, of course, if you are aiming at any kind of quality, you can't leave doing literary translation. So, in any case, it is a truth universally acknowledged in Russia that the great tradition of Soviet translation, the great legacy of Soviet translation school, has been lost, and we are now facing an avalanche of very bad translations and very bad translators who are doing half-baked jobs out of classics and modern literature and so on. We would like to quote Mikhail Leonovich Gasparov, a wonderful scholar and translator, and we'll talk about him a little bit later. This is something he said in an interview on a different topic, but I'm sure that his views on translation were exactly the same. So when he was asked in a very silly questionnaire by Men's Magazine, why did they choose him to be answering in their magazine is beyond me. But anyway, so why do you think in our recent totalitarian past literature was on the rise, but when all bans were lifted, it ceased to exist? And his answer was very simply, was it really on such a rise? Has it really quite ceased to exist? The quality and the money are not the only things that have changed since Soviet times. People tend to forget that during the major part of the Soviet period, all literary translation in Russia was pirated. The Soviet Union didn't join the Berne Convention, I think it was, before 1973. And even when we were beginning our translator's career, one of the first questions that a publisher asked, was the book you want to translate published before 73? And if it was, then okay, you could do it for free. You didn't have to pay for the copyrights. This situation no longer exists. There are virtually no pirated translation in today's Russia. And so everything has to be bought. It's not huge money, but still it's a different situation. The Soviet officials like to boast that the Soviet Union was the most reading country in the world. And that the sheer number of translations published was above anything that was published in any other country, which was partially true, but a lot of that was achieved through translating within the Soviet Union. A lot of that was translations between the languages of the former Soviet Union into Russian and from Russian into national languages. The situation with the number of titles and with the numbers of print run was reversed in Soviet times as opposed to what it is now. There are many, many more titles published now than in Soviet Union, but the print runs have declined very sharply because in Soviet times any book of any merit was published at least in 100,000 copies, and everyone would buy that. This is an interesting example of such Soviet experiment, which is the World Literature Library, published in the late 60s and early 70s in several series dedicated to ancient literature, 18th century literature, 19th century literature, and modern literature. And the print run of every volume was about 300,000 copies, and it was sold out anyway immediately, so it wasn't enough for the voracious appetite of Soviet readers of that time. Censorship was very active, and we'll come back to that in some detail later. So, some people in the West tend to think that censorship is still a problem for today's Russian literature, but it isn't, because nobody is really interested in literature. On TV, the censorship is a real problem, but in book business, there is no censorship whatsoever. You can publish absolutely anything you want. But since the print runs were so high, since the censorship was active, the translators had an abnormally high status in Soviet culture. They were some kind of prophets who were telling something from the other side, from behind the Iron Curtain. And today's status of translators is, of course, very different. Another thing was that, as I said, there were mostly internal translations, or much of that was internal translations within the Soviet Union. And there were such cases as the case of Jambul, the famous Kazakh Akin, singer, like rhapsode, which some people claim the poems that were translated into Russian weren't even translations of the actual Kazakh texts. They were invented by the translators, or at least very thoroughly reworked. And that was the situation with much of translation from national languages of the Soviet Union, which was, in a sense, a refuge for lots and lots of brilliant poets and writers who couldn't publish their own work for ideological reasons, but who could earn money at least through translating poems from Kazakh or Latvian or Uzbek and so on. To you.
Yes, and actually there are many poems by, for example, a great poet, Arseny Tarkovsky, who complained that his best years were wasted for other people's words, because he had to translate this kind of internal Soviet poetry from word-by-word translations provided for him. And really many such translations did not have originals at all. And a famous translator, Evgeny Vitkovsky, coined the word jambulization of literature. But actually, if we come back to post-Soviet period, we can see that the situation in early 90s after perestroika was very similar to the situation in early 20s, straight after the revolution. Because straight after perestroika, there was no copyright yet, and there were many private publishing houses that published all kind of translation in great hurry to satisfy appetite for Western literature that was for so long forbidden. And actually, these translations were also very loose, and they dropped a lot. For example, they started translating Henry Miller, because of course there was no question of translated Henry Miller during Soviet times. There was one book translated by Yegorov in America and brought to the Soviet Union in all kinds of manuscripts, etc. Samizdat, yes. But they started translating Henry Miller, but what happened? They only translated sex scenes, and they would omit any mentioning of Sherwood Anderson, for example, because who would be interested? It's a completely different kind of book. So this was a situation where people translated a lot, and there were many very bad translations, exactly like in early 20s, and everybody complained about it, but there was nothing could be done immediately about it. What happened in early 20s was that two main publishing houses made two main directions in translation. One was actually that's something that is now on screen. Is the first Russian batch exporter, which was translated in verse without any. Actually, the plot had only very slight similarity to her book. And also, as you can see, she was not mentioned as an author even, but she was mentioned as an illustrator. But as you can see, illustrations themselves were altered. You can see that the dolls and the policemen acquired Russian flavor instead of what was drawn initially. And that is a very good symbol of what was happening in the early 20s with literature and illustration and the whole of it. But the great idea behind all the translation was the publishing house World Literature, founded by Maxim Gorky, and the idea was that all world literature should be translated immediately and given to workers and peasants as a bulk, so that they could acquire all the culture of the world right now and here. And of course, it influenced the way it should have been translated, because of course it should be a translation that is easily read, that is clear, that can be read actually without much background. And there was another famous publishing house, Academia, which was of opposing intention to create very high quality elitist books with a lot of commentary, with a lot of going into details, very precise translation. They even worked upon rules of technologically precise translation, which meant that every repetition, every author's repetition should be transferred to the translation, syntax should be minded, no omissions, no additions. And if you come back one slide, Kornei Chukovsky, famous writer and translator, became an ideologist of foreign literature because he published a book, Fine Art of Translation, where he made his rules. And his rules were to translate a smile with a smile, a laughter with a laughter, and not just words and phrases. And actually it was a really great contrast to what this first black flock of formalists, so-called formalists, required. Very soon, formalists were condemned not just by fellow translators, but officially. And some of them were executed, imprisoned, some of them not. But they were not given any opportunity to work further. But they left some books, for example, Pickwick Papers, in the translation with a lot of commentary, where, for example, translators tried to make... In Russian, there is no difference between, for example, solicitor and barrister. There are no such notion. But they would bring into translation foreign words, explain them, bring in a commentary with all kind of illustrations, explanations, etc. And they were condemned as elitist and formalist publishing house. It was closed, and the translation principles became universal. All diversity was banned. And here we see Ivan Kashkin. It's the main prophet of realistic translation, who actually he coined this social realism in translation, which is a very enigmatic term, which he never explained himself, but Gasparov did.
Yeah, there is an article by Gasparov where he put it very succinctly, as he usually did. And basically the idea was that when you translate something, you should translate it as it is, and not as the writer says. An example of that was Kashkin's scathing critic of Szengeli's translation of Byron's Don Juan. where Suvorov is mentioned, the famous Russian general, in not very complimentary terms. So Kashkin criticized Shengeli for that very harshly, because the idea is you should translate Suvorov as he was, a great patriot, a great hero, and so on, and not as this wretched British imperialist wrote about him. So that was the idea, more or less, of socialist translation, and you'll see that this school has persisted in Soviet times with some tenacity. There was a real bottleneck in Soviet translation, in Soviet translators' life, because there were only so many ways to become a translator. You could basically enter the profession through several venues, and they were few and far between. Kashkin and his school was one of them. There were several others, which all more or less worked under this umbrella of Tchaikovsky's ideas and Kashkin's ideas of translation as very good Russian literature, of translation as being faithful to the Russian language and to the Russian style, and so on and so forth. The originals were somehow of secondary importance in that context. Another blow to the ideas of people who wanted to show the foreign essence of foreign literature was dealt starting from the 30s and culminating, I think, in the late 40s with the fight against cosmopolitans.
Which is euphemism for Jewish.
Mostly, yes. The magazine Foreign Literature was suppressed.
And it was called International Literature then, and it was closed.
And it was renewed as иностранная литература, as foreign literature, only after Stalin's death in 1955.
And actually, Kashkin, who we saw, is mostly connected with the name of Hemingway. Because, you see, translators always were connected with the writers they discovered for the Russian readership. And they really, very often, publishing of this or that writer was initiative of this or that translator. And translators really sometimes spent years of their life trying to persuade publishing houses and party authorities to publish their favorite writer. So Kashkin is very much connected with Hemingway because a lot of Hemingway was translated by him or edited by him. His group, so-called Kashkinki, they were mostly women who worked under his leadership, and they were the main group of translators at the time. So two of them translated For Whom the Bell Tolls, Volzhina and Kalashnikova. And they first did it in 1941, 1 year after the novel was published originally. But it was published only in 1968. So it was more than 20 years in between, and a lot of versions of their translations. And actually, it's fascinating. Recently, this year, we had a diploma paper of our student who went to archives and worked with different versions of this translation with editor's notes on the margins and censor's notes on the margins. And sometimes they argue whether to omit this and that, or to add something, or to change things. It's fascinating reading. We'll give you...
We should note here that Hemingway was very much a household name in the 60s in Russia, and this portrait was hanging in almost every home of the intelligentsia as if he were some kind of a uncle or grandfather. Yes.
Universal grandfather. You would see him everywhere. This
specific picture contributed immensely to the popularity of turtleneck sweaters in Russia. So the importance of Hemingway and his work in Soviet literature is beyond compare. It's especially interesting because when we look at what was being done to his text.
Next slide, and next slide. Yes, that's just one example for you to see what is happening with the text in this translation. Here is the commander who is both cruel, reckless, and know how to forge a division into a fighting unit.
Who is a Spanish Republican.
And yes, and here
So
you
a
can
good
see, yes, but in the novel he's both good and cruel guy. But in the translation, as you see,
No,
there
no,
is...
I'm saying what he should be.
Yes, but what he should be
Is a good guy.
is a good guy. So everything about him being cruel or lacking respect for life or anything else would be deleted. And then you have a phrase without any controversy that he was strict in discipline.
So everything that you see in red and in square brackets was deleted from translation.
Yes, everything in red was deleted, and in blue was added. So as you can see, it wouldn't go with formalist requirement, no additions, no omissions. Next slide. That's another one. As you understand, the phrases that are in red would never be published in the Soviet Union, so they are omitted. Yes, and then you have something completely different. And actually, all in all, about the 20 long passages were dropped, and virtually every phrase was changed. And
Tell about the...
yes, and it's fascinating because there were a lot of factors outside the text that influenced publishing or not publishing. Because first, the writer could say something wrong about Soviet Union, and then his book would be never published. Or a translator could go abroad and stay there, immigrate, and then the translation would be never published.
At least under this name.
Or, like in Hemingway's case, he obviously insulted some communist leaders of Spain by the novel, and while they were unhappy, the book couldn't be published. And also there was a character who was based on a Soviet journalist, writer, and secret agent Koltsov, who was executed by the time. And he was sort of a good guy in the novel. But he was executed in the Soviet Union.
So as soon as he returned from Spain, he was arrested, and in a couple of years he was shot.
And it was no way to publish the novel with a good character based on someone who was imprisoned and executed. But then, luckily, he was rehabilitated after Stalin's death. And then there was new opportunity to try and publish the book. So the fate of the book was very difficult and depending on many factors. And of course, translators in this context were not even prophets of foreign literature, but noble smugglers that would bring forbidden goods into the country. And of course, in this risky process, the goods were damaged. And why we are talking today about it, though our topic obviously is post-Soviet translation, because this is the translation which is still sold and read in Russian, and there is no other one. And this is one of the highest examples of absolutely perfect, faultless Soviet translation.
Also, people who read it now, they don't have the idea of how much liberty the editors and the censors took with the text. Because I was fascinated with this story about the main character sleeping with a girl in a sleeping bag.
And then they deleted parts of the phrase, and then girl is not in the sleeping bag anymore because it's sort of immoral, because it was another thing always deleted for Soviet publishing. And that was it. That's how it's read now. There are a couple of characters that are omitted, a couple of chapters, but if there was a good description of nature in the chapter, it would be put into another chapter, not to lose it.
Well, there were some other examples, because it was not always like that. And one of the cases we wanted to talk about is the case of the Russian Salinger. J.D. Salinger was also one of the key figures for the Soviet literature and for Russian readers. And a recent new translation of his opus has created lots of controversy, and Sasha will talk about it a little bit later. We would like to recount a kind of an anecdote about this thing, because
it was translated by Rita Wright-Kovaleva in the Soviet times. And if there was a sacred cow of translation, that is she. She's a brilliant translator, and her books are really read very well in Russian. But of course, she also was part of this necessary procedures of adapting books to the requirements.
So basically, the only quips that were allowed to be aimed at Wright-Kovaleva and the cohort of great Soviet translators, and we don't mean any irony here, they were great people who did a great job, were some small things that they could have omitted or they couldn't know. And for example, in one of Salinger's texts, a hamburger is translated as бутерброд с котлетой, which is in a sense okay, because first
because it is бутерброд с котлетой, sandwich with a meatball.
Yes. And second, people the word didn't exist in Russian. It does now. And sometimes people just didn't know what it is. There is a wonderful story told by the friends of Liliana Longina, another brilliant translator of Swedish, French and German literature, and I think she was translating from one of these languages, not from English. And she came upon the word hamburger in one of the texts she was translating, and she went to her husband,
a very educated man.
Very educated man and
film director.
Film director, yes. And he said, there is something that the character, he took a hamburger and...
he's carrying it.
He went out of his apartment carrying it. What do you think it is? And he said, well, I don't know, maybe it's an item of clothing, maybe it's some kind of an overcoat. Well, okay, do you think I can write, because I think I'll write that he carried a hamburger around his arm. Right? Okay, so he's carrying it, and then she reads on, and then she says with astonishment, oh my God, he ate it up. So obviously there was no way for a translator back then to Google it or to ask some native speakers what it was. But the problems with translators of that kind, this is Liliana Longina who told the story, were not like that. So what do we do with a hamburger in a Russian text, or in a Russian text that was translated in the 60s or 70s? Бутерброд с котлетой, which is here on the left, is not a good translation because a hamburger is a quintessential street food. It's fast food, it's cheap food, and so on. And бутерброд с котлетой is something that your mother would give you when you go to school. It's quintessentially home food. So a kind of an equivalent could be something like you see on the right, a beляш, which is traditionally a Tatar dish, but which was sold in the Soviet times in the streets. But again, you can't add this kind of Soviet flavor to an American book. It would seem very strange. So thank God that now we have the word hamburger and we don't have to wrap our heads around it.
And this is Rita Wright-Kovaleva, about whom a joke was, an anecdote was recollected by Dovlatov. It's a very famous Russian Soviet writer who once was asked by a writer, Vera Panova, whose Russian language, who's the best writer now in Russian. And he said, Rita Wright. And she said, what, the translator of Vonnegut and Salinger? He said, yes. So she said, Vonnegut is read in Russian better than Fedin. He said, yes, of course. And she said, that's horrible. And so actually it was very much what was happening, because mostly Salinger, Vonnegut, and other writers were read in Russian better than Soviet writers who were allowed to be published. And all literature that was published later that people knew about sometimes and sometimes didn't, it was done without any hope to be published. And so translation had absolutely uncharacteristic role in language and culture, to be the literature, to be something people could read and see some new happenings in the language, in the thinking, in literary art. But it was completely impossible to find all this in Soviet writings that were published. And this is contemporary translator of...
Sorry, may I just add
Yes.
to that? That this tradition of Raid Kovaleva being the best Russian author, the best Russian style, this tradition of seeing it as, indeed, as a sacred cow, has persisted to this day. And that was the problem with the controversy. In Dovlatov, I think, there is another joke about that when he says that Kurt Vonnegut's novels lose a lot in the original. And but
for him it's only half a joke.
Yes, indeed, because he writes elsewhere that unlike the English or the Americans or the French, he doesn't have to learn foreign languages because he can use the translations that are so great.
And actually, Raid Kovaleva's translations of Salinger are not her best ones, because especially when it comes to short stories, they are so different in the original and the translation that it's like two different writers. Because what else was eliminated and changed a lot in Russian translations was style. Because everything strange, odd, out of the ordinary was suspicious. And immediately some party control would say that it's formalism or naturalism. All these were words for something not exactly ours, not socialist realism, not something we want to read and see. And Salinger is a very strange author, and she made him a lot more normal. And of course, Hamburger was the smallest of her problems, because as you remember, the novel, The Catcher in the Rye, the main character speaks in a slang, and he uses all kinds of words which were completely forbidden. And it was not because, like now some people say that Rita Wright was an elderly woman when she was translating it, and that's why she couldn't use all the words. But that's not true. She was an old woman who could tell a joke with all kinds of curse words and was not at all embarrassed. And she was strictly forbidden to use. She asked to allow her to put mildly rude words there, and she was denied this.
Жопа, right?
Говнюк. But she was denied this possibility. So actually, she didn't have any other option. And as it is, this novel, again, is written in beautiful Russian language, but a lot of things there are changed, and the whole book is very much the different book. And of course, people who read in English can see it. And so probably the black sheep of the most notoriety in Russia, Max Nemtsov, who is translator of many authors who were not published at all in the Soviet times, but also of some that were, decided to make a new translation of Salinger, of the whole, of all his works.
Which is just a small book, basically. It
was actually a major scandal. When he published the book, there were lots and lots of articles condemning him for actually sacrilegious attitude to great Raid Kovaleva. Interestingly, first, almost all people who wrote these articles didn't read his translation.
So what happened, there was a small fragment, a couple of pages, and the table of contents published online. So that was what everybody read.
And all the examples were from these 2 pages and table of content. Secondly, nobody was talking about how close his translation is to the original. Everybody was discussing how far it is from the translation we know. And it was especially funny when it came to raise high the roof carpenters, because it's quote from Sappho. And he took the translation of one of the poets of this line. And he was immediately criticized for making the wrong title, because Rita Wright translated the line herself, and it was a different line. And they said he even couldn't get this right.
And it's a quote.
And it's a quote. But of course, as we understand, it was not a quote from Rita Wright. It was a quote of Sappho. So in people's minds, the real author of our Salinger is Rita Wright. And if there is other Salinger, he certainly is inferior to our Salinger. And we're not interested in him. We are interested in our book that we know by heart. And when someone wants to challenge that, we actually are really ready to kill him for this outrageous behavior.
Yeah, basically, if Salinger says it differently, so much worse for Salinger. Even in Soviet times, this uniformity was not the only option for translators, because there are always some flukes and some gaps and some cracks in the system. One of such gaps was an amazing story of the translation, one of the many translations of Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, made by Nina Demurova, who is here in Indian attire, because she spent some time in India. And she was not even a translator, because, as I said, it was very difficult to get into the very close translator circle. She was a teacher of English and English literature at Moscow.
First at Moscow State University, and then in
Moscow Teaching University. And what happened was that one of the officials responsible for translation of books from the countries of people's democracy, from the Eastern European communist countries, saw in the list of Bulgarian books published in Bulgaria, that a children's book was published, Alice in Wonderland. And he said, it seems to be popular and a nice book, why don't we translate it from Bulgarian? And so it made the rounds, and since it was a completely different circle, it didn't go to the English translators who were, established. And it somehow ended up with Demurova, who said it's not a Bulgarian book, it should be translated from Bulgarian. But anyway, the idea went through, and she did translate it, not from Bulgarian, of course. And it was published in Sofia, in Russian, by the publishing house that was publishing books in foreign languages.
And actually the officials there could not understand why the translator who translated this book from Bulgarian didn't speak a word of Bulgarian when she came there to get.
And she had to go to Bulgaria to receive her payment. There is a persistent urban legend in Russia to this day that she's a Bulgarian, that's why the book was published in Bulgaria, and so on. And I've seen it on the internet a couple of times mentioned, well, she's a Bulgarian, but her Russian is so good, she made a great job, and so on.
And it's the best translation of Alice in Wonderland that we have in Russian.
Well, at least it was later reused in a Soviet publication in the series called Literatурные памятники, which was a series of very academic translations with comments and so on. And basically that was the only translation of Alice in Wonderland, among many, that could be used in an academic setting.
Because being out of establishment translated, Demurova was much more precise. And she stands out not only because of her not belonging to any circle, but because of her translation method, which is especially amazing because it's children's books, and children's books traditionally were retold, chapters omitted, characters dropped, illustrations altered. So children's books really traditionally were very loose in translation. And so Demurova just the one translator who tried to bring British authors to Russia as they are.
Children's books sometimes were just pirated without any consideration of their authorship. That's a long-going Russian tradition, because one of the most famous Russian children's book, Приключения Буратино by Alexei Tolstoy, is basically a reworking of Collodi's Pinocchio. And another example is a very famous series which started with the book Волшебник изумрудного города, the magician of the Emerald City, which was a reworking of The Wizard of Oz by Frank Baum and made by one Alexander Volkov.
And there's name on the Alexander Volkov, and that's it. There is no Baum.
Well, there is a foreword where he said that he read this book and he liked it and he liked to retell it, but that's it. And he even wrote a series of very ideologically minded sequels to this first book, which were now his own without any. But that's a translation. It's not even a retelling. It's just a loose translation. But his name, Baum's name, is not mentioned anywhere. Then there were translators such as Viktor Golyshev,
Our teacher.
Yes, who translated William Faulkner, among other authors, for example, and was proud of not adding a single comma or a single full stop, which is, of course, very difficult.
Especially in Faulkner's case. Yeah.
Then there was Mikhail Gasparov, whom we mentioned a couple of times before, and who was a great translator, first and foremost, of classical literature, of Greek and Roman authors, but not only that. And the interesting thing was that Gasparov's translations were sometimes very precise, very exact. You can just really take a Latin text and the Russian text, and everything will be there. Nothing will be lost. That was something that in the classical ghetto was acceptable. This kind of sticking to the original, because translations from classical languages were almost exclusively made by classical scholars. Whereas, for example, translations from classical Oriental literature, like Persian or Arabic, were usually made not by Orientalists, but by poets. So sometimes an Arabic scholar would make a word-by-word translation, and then some very imaginative poet would make a verse translation. So these two classical tradition, the Western tradition and the Eastern traditions, were rendered into Russian from two completely different angles. So in classical, in Greek and Roman literature, it was more acceptable. And one of the examples that Gasparov recounts in his memoirs is how he approached the translation of Aesop's fables, which are written in very simple style. But as basically nobody can have a native knowledge of that style and can understand how literate or how folksy it is. What he did was he took a huge monograph on the style of Aesop, and he colored all the words which were classical Attic words in blue, and the words which were regional words in red. And so the pages where there was more red than blue, he translated "Пошел пастух," and for example, and where there were more classical words, he translated as "Пастух пошел."
With slight inversion.
So basically, in one case, more literal, more neutral translation, and in another case, something that tends to be closer to a folk tale or a fairy tale. But these are the lengths to which Russian translators almost never descended. And that's why Gasparov was a unique example. And not only in that, there was another case with Gasparov and the story of translation when he published with a young relative of his a lengthy discussion of the translation of Shakespeare's sonnets made by Samuel Marshak, a famous poet and children's author, whose translation of Shakespeare's sonnets is considered to be the translation, the best, the most brilliant, and so on. And Gasparov was thinking very highly of this translation. The only problem was that it was a translation into a style which was completely alien to Shakespeare. It was a translation into a very neutralized, a very 19th centuryized style of Russian poetry, very unlike the rough and raw material of Shakespearean verse. And this article, very scholarly with lots of examples and comparisons, was banned. And Gasparov, who was at the moment editing a volume of Marshak's own poetry, was fired from that position. And his young relative was not allowed to continue his studies at as a postgraduate student at the Moscow University. So the attempt to question, even in a very academic settings, the sacred cows of Russian translations indeed involved very high stakes.
And as we probably showed, there was diversity in Soviet translation. And as long as nobody proclaimed it, as long as nobody would say that probably there is not only one method, it was okay. People were okay with different translations. It was not allowed to say so. And it's very important, a very important division. And now, the diversity, of course, is much more nowadays because there is no pressure and no censorship, etc. And probably the main venues that translators can take. By the way, Dimurova is still working actively. Golyshev is still working actively, so they work as translators. Dimurova was never dependent on translation for her living. That's why she's so different. Golyshev still works only as a translator, and that's his pupil, Vladimir Babkov, who is a very good translator, taught by Golyshev and completely absorbing his principles of being only literary translator and nothing else. And of course, in our today's situation is very close to heroism, because as we explained, it's not really something that can sustain you. Also, there are other ways to be in the profession. For example, Yelena Kostyukovich, the translator of Umberto Eco. She lives in Italy, and she's not just a translator, but she's a manager of all translations of Eco in a number of countries. She's agent, she's a publisher, teacher. So she actually has many roles, and she's the translator of Umberto Eco in Russian. Also, there are workshops, and this is Natalia Mavlevich, who used to be in the workshop of Lungina, and now she has her own workshop, and of course, this kind of...
Translating from French,
and this kind of teaching students, and actually many young talented translators come from workshop taught by some translator of previous generation. Like we were taught by Golyshev, and now we teach our workshop in Moscow State University. That's the book mentioned by Oliver at the beginning, not just Holmes, their collection of detective stories of Victorian times, but not by Conan Doyle, that we did with our students. And again, we probably came back to this black flock of academia because it has a lot of new words in Russian. For example, we didn't translate dog, cart, Victoria, handsome as carriage, but we brought in all the words and then explained them in a special illustrated glossary where you can see how all these carriages looked like. And so we probably, again, we employed more of formalist approach, but we were not, actually readers loved it and nobody reproached us.
However, the interesting thing is, yes, that readers loved it, critics loved it, everybody said how wonderful it is that the book has a glossary, that you explain it and so on. And it was a major academic effort, if we may say so ourselves, because every student researched his or her author, wrote a foreword describing the life and work of this and that crime writer. Translated very carefully, and every story in this book was edited by the whole group of our students and by us sitting all together, reading aloud.
No additions, no omissions.
Comparing every word with the original. And there were several articles in this book. There was an article by Sasha about the history of the detective genre, and an article by our dear friend who unfortunately died a year ago, about the real police work in Britain and the United States of the Victorian times.
But however, people liked it. When I tried to write an article about bookvalism, literalism, this academia people, etc., trying to prove that they were not all that bad, I had immediate impact from academic people all around saying that it's something that shouldn't be said ever, and people were really angry because everybody knows that literalism is bad. And Gasparov, in his early attempt to argue with it in 1973, had to explain that it's not a curse word. It's actually a method.
Yes, well, his actual words were that literalism is not a curse word, it's a scholarly notion. But it's not.
But it's not
perceived.
understood
Yeah.
even now. It's interestingly, when someone wants to say something good about translation, they said that it is read as if it was written in Russian, and when they want to say something bad, they say it's literalist. And I read a thesis by someone who analyzed two translations of Janer, and one of them is very loose translation. And I like it better. But the other is more precise, and I don't particularly like it. But this author of the thesis, she liked the precise one. And that's why she condemned the loose one as literalist. Because this term doesn't have a real, it's just a curse word at the moment. And it's very interesting how people don't really give it any meaning except that they don't like the translation. But the majority of translators today combine translation work as labor of love with some other work that would help them to earn their living. And so we need to say that today it's not so much a profession as a hobby, though there are many people, including very well-educated and talented young people who we teach, who do it well. But anyway, they only can do it as a hobby, not as a profession that would be their only occupation.
It's interesting, however, that there seems to be a desire among that part of the public that is still the reading public to be closer to the original text. And sometimes there are attempts to do it on their own. For example, with the Harry Potter books, amazingly, especially with the last volume, the Russian online translation, a collective effort involving, I think, hundreds of people, was completed in about 7 days after the publication. It was bad. But it was. But
it's interesting that it exists.
Yeah, and it was a several stages process with people editing, with people comparing to the original, and there was a lot of criticism aimed at the so-called official translations that were published by the holder of the copyright for Russian editions of Harry Potter books, aimed at the unprecise manner, the inconsistencies, the omissions, and so on and so forth. So now, when people have more access to the originals, when there is no enigma in a hamburger, perhaps it's time to rethink the idea of sacred cows of Russian literary translation, and to indeed honor the work of those people who went against against the grain and against the threat.
And probably it's the major problem that we have today, that the golden standard of the translation are mostly required by editors and universally expected, is the model of Soviet times, which was a translation for everybody, a translation with 300,000 copies in the print run. And nowadays, with smaller runs and more titles, elitist translation or just translation aimed at certain target audience started to come into being. And this type of translation just requires different rules. And that's something not recognized, but something that happened.
So to conclude, we would like to thank you very warmly for your attention, and to thank those people who made our visit and our presentation possible. First of all, Oliver, for thinking of inviting us to this wonderful series of events. Our students, Andrei Azov and Ekaterina Kuznetsova, whose research we used in our presentation, and Tatiana Rusita, who drew the pictures that you saw. Thank you very much. And of course, we would be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Certainly have some time for questions. Who would like to jump in first? Karen and Brian,
if you'll forgive me, because I've got to go. The examples that you gave of post-Soviet translation did not, I think, bring in books which are regarded as of great literary quality in Britain. I'm talking about British literature. Fine, but Harry Potter is pretty neutral anyway. The one thing that you didn't discuss was tone. Now, I understand the problems of how literal you are and how far you turn it into good Russian. But surely it is possible to give much more attention to what kind of a work this is altogether, and therefore of the tone of it, of the different kinds of possibly irony, and of course in English literature there's all kinds, but lots of irony, but also, you know, how self-amused something may be, how humane in its vocabulary, how much messages are sent out from the author, which are not just in this word and that word and the syntax, for goodness sake, but in the whole sense of what is being done. Now, how much is this, and can this be discussed in your translation workshops?
Actually, we do this a lot. Of course, we discuss this mostly with the students. Of course, we discuss mostly every individual story or whatever we're translating, and that's what we're talking about. We didn't bring the examples of the kind because it would be a little bit too complicated to discuss this as well as the overall situation. But of course, that's naturally that's what all translators care about. And it didn't, if you're asking whether this concern became less important in a modern situation, the answer is no.
No, I'm not asking that. I'm just saying, what do you do about that? Because that seems to me to be the real issue.
Well, we, in our teaching practice, we do not try to eliminate the concern for good Russian or for the tone or for the overall atmosphere of the work. What we're trying to do is to not let these ideas obfuscate the original behind that and being true to the original text. Because the idea of text is something that is relatively new in Russian humanities as it is. It's only post-Soviet, basically. So
we just recognize that there can be different types of translation. Good translations can be different. So we try to give this freedom to our student because it's obvious that even with the tone and everything, there can be one translation that is good and understands all this tone and everything in one way, and the other translation that is good but different. So that's probably what we do. We explain that there is not just one perfect translation, but many versions.
You had a question?
Yes, in Soviet times, what happened to standards when it came to samizdat?
It's a very good question. I believe it was different because in samizdat very different people worked. And for example, there is very famous translator Natalia Trauberg, who mostly worked for samizdat before Soviet times, and then she was published. And she mostly translated Chesterton and C.S. Lewis. And her translations are very good, though they are loose as the standard was, but they are very good, and she put a lot of effort into the tone and into this voice of the author, and
single-handedly created a boom of interest, especially.
Yes, and actually single-handedly created interest to Chesterton and C.S. Lewis. It's amazing. But of course, some of that were actually everywhere. There were good translations and bad translations, and it's a great mistake to think that Soviet translations were all good. That's simply not true. Even with the bottleneck, even with all the editing, there are lots of mistakes. There are many bad translations. So actually,
especially if you compare them to the originals, because in this case, you see.
Actually, it depended on individual translator, as always.
But presumably with samizdat translations, you wouldn't have had chunks left out or alteration of text unless it was really incompetent, would you? Or might you?
It could be competent or incompetent, depending on who was doing it.
On the competence of the individual person.
We can't really answer the question because we didn't do research into samizdat translations. We read some, and some were good, and some were bad, but no real correlation.
But I think that generally speaking, translation was not that much on the minds of people who were trying to publish something on their own, because there was so much that people wanted to say with their own voices.
However, Yegorov's translation of Miller is very good.
Yes.
It's brilliant. Trauberg's translations of Chesterton are very good. So
But there were translations like, I don't know, Nabokov's self-translation of Lolita, which was also a major event, and it couldn't be published in Russia, of course.
But it wouldn't be true to say that they were tended to be done more carelessly or hastily.
We haven't done the research,
yeah,
because we wouldn't want to jump to conclusions. We're not sure, we don't know. If we analyzed 100 of them, we would tell you.
But I think that many people who were in these samizdat circles, they were in, or at least very close, to people working officially. So
some of them were professional translators.
Yes, so perhaps the ideas of standards at that time was more or less uniform, whereas now, for example, quite often people work without any editors or sometimes without any proofreaders, and you have all kinds of funny translations, which were a little bit less possible back then, though not completely impossible.
Is the story of the publishing house Artists in Ann Arbor known to you? And I know that I've worked for them for a while. Carl and Ellen de Proffer were very close to the Kopyovs, Raisa, Lova especially. And it seemed that this same elite group of translators was also very keen as early as 1970, because that's when we first talked about it, to make this connection and to make sure that samizdat would be published as well as other things into English. And so that's you know about all of that.
Yeah, well, we know about Artists, of course, and I think that perhaps the interrelations between what was happening in the West with Russian literature in translation and in Russian literature which was published in the West, and what was happening inside the Soviet Union are not well researched yet, because quite recently I saw a very interesting memoir by an American, I think, scholar who used to be a student back in the 70s, and he was complaining that amazingly at an American university the course of Russian literature only contained official Soviet literature. They only read Sholokhov and Gorky, and they didn't even
university? Who and which university?
Oh, I don't know. It was some kind of an Ivy League university. It wasn't in Montana or something.
That's astonishing, because in our day that wasn't the case when we were in university.
Well,
also, the hamburger story.
Yes.
I mean, there were all of these alcoholic communists living and working for Progress. They surely could have told them what was happening. They knew each other.
Yeah, it's possible. It's possible, but I think that even the alcoholic communists
no,
working
but
for...
it is translated as бутерброд с котлетой in Salinger, no doubt about it.
But that isn't why.
Yes, that's probably isn't why, but I think that with Lungina it's very possible, because she couldn't go abroad, and she surely didn't know these communists in Raduga, because she also was out of the establishment.
But if she lived in Moscow, good heavens.
Yeah, well, even in our recollection, though we were
didn't know what
relatively
it was
young
till we
when
were,
the Soviet Union collapsed, the idea of communicating with foreigners, even drunken communists working in Raduga, was very suspicious. Yeah, and among our friends, very few people.
We didn't know what hamburger was before first McDonald's came to Moscow.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you a question about the historical aspect, because it seemed to me you were very dismissive of Gorky's Mirovaya Literatura and...
Oh,
no,
not at all.
Maybe I misunderstood then in that case, because I thought you were... Could you just say a little bit more about how you rate the translations that were produced by those, particularly by Mirovaya Literatura? I mean, Academia is obviously an academic series, but...
I think that the majority of them were good translations, though they were not so good translations as well. There was no uniform quality. But of course, they all would be censored. Of course, they all would have very serious changes in the text. But of course, it's not the fault of the people who were doing it. They didn't have any other option. But let's say I would look at it very attentively before publishing it today, because as we saw with Hemingway, it can be very changed translation.
But the censorship wasn't that wasn't that elaborate or detailed in those early years.
No.
No.
So I do think they were looking that closely at these
I
But on the other
think-
hand, there are lots of articles by translators themselves and by writers such as Mandelstam bemoaning
criticized.
the quality of translations, not within, maybe not within мировая литература, всемирная литература, but other publishing houses that were doing the same, or jumping the bandwagon and translating as much as possible. Because there was a time when the Russian culture was expanding to a huge number of people who were not covered by any kind of education or any contact with foreign literature before.
But it was done by a very elite group of
Yes.
writers who knew what they were
Yes,
talking
yes.
about.
Some of them-
And who edited the
But the
work.
target audience, they had to think of target audience as anyone has, of course. And so it had to be adapted somehow.
Also, very often Gorky tended to help people who were not professional translators but knew languages because they had governesses, etc. And very often he would give work to people who didn't know how to translate, actually, but just needed money. So they were very different quality of these translations. Yes.
A more mundane question. Whenever I go into a bookshop in Russia, it strikes me how large the section for translated literature actually
Yes.
is in comparison to what you find here.
Yes.
So you have sometimes иностранная литература, which is just as large as отечественная литература. So I'm surprised that it's impossible to make a living as a translator. I mean, who are the people who actually translate all these books?
I think there are too many translators. That's part of the problem, isn't
That's
it?
right.
That drives
Yes,
these
there are a
down.
lot of...
This is still very much a buyer's market.
Right.
And apart from just a couple of names like Golyshev, people can get decent rates, and because there are so many people who think they can translate, and the publishers don't really care.
Some do, but very few. Some publishers do care.
Because the quality of translation affects the sales in such a negligible manner,
Or not at all.
or not at all, that
As
it's not
research
worthwhile
showed.
for a publisher to pay more to a good translator than to hire just a second-year student.
And it doesn't work in the way that bestseller would be given to better translator, because, for example, Dan Brown novels were translated. It's atrocious translations.
Yeah,
Mistake in every sentence, sometimes 2 or 3. And it's the same translator who translated First Samuel as I Samuel. And she has no idea about anything at all. And still she's given this job because she probably works very quickly.
But
Dan
what is
Brown deserves it.
Yes, I agree with you. But she also
There are so
spoiled
many
some very
people
good
who don't.
writers. Yes, yes.
Can I ask you a very general question?
Yes.
Can you tell us something about the evolution of the Russian language since the breakup of the Soviet Union? Because there must be quite a lot of differences. I mean, words like stilyagi, for instance, is that still used?
Yes,
Slang expression?
as
No.
historical word.
it's a historical word about the 60s, yes, but
It's
not.
a word belonging to 60s
Yeah,
and
of
meaning
course.
these
So
people in the
if
60s.
you use
Yes.
this word, you immediately put it into a historical.
Historical. That's purely in
Yes.
reference to
Yes.
that.
Yes.
You wouldn't
Yes.
use it.
Yes.
Well,
No.
actually, we about a month ago we were in Edinburgh at the invitation of the Princess Dashkova Russian Center there, and we gave a talk about
Specifically about Russian language
specifically
after
about
perestroika.
the perceived onslaught of foreign, especially English words and phrases and constructions onto the Russian language, because the general idea, the general perception, almost as is the case with the translation business, is that the Russian language is dying under this onslaught. And again, our position was that it's not all that tragic, that there are some normal things that are happening to a language.
Yeah, we're actually slightly more optimistic than average about both Russian language and Russian translation. tradition.
What we can say about that is that you have every educated, cultured, so to say, Russian person has this, especially with some kind of linguistic training, necessarily has a schizophrenic attitude towards this problem. Because on the one hand, when you hear some ridiculous foreign words or Russian words for that matter used in all kinds of wild situations, then indeed you feel some sadness about what's happening to the language. Or cases dropped, language, the syntax mangled and so on. It's happening all the time. You hear it on TV, on radio, in every newspaper and so on. But on the other hand, you have to understand that this is something that's happening always, in every language. And in that Edinburgh speech, we gave examples of how people from George Orwell to Jonathan Swift to all the way to Cicero,
all the time,
complained about the death
About
of their
every
language.
age and every language, you find these complaints that language is dying. So probably.
Can I ask something going back to the one of the main themes of the talk is something very paradoxical, that translation, which is the most international activity, is somehow nationalized in Russia.
Oh yeah.
In a way.
Yes.
And I mean, when I've seen that from the other side, when I was involved in the historian Gabriel Gorodetzky is doing an edition in English of the diaries of Ivan Maisky, who was the Soviet ambassador in London in the 30s and 40s. And it was a great job for him to get the rights from, I can't remember which institute in Moscow it was, to have the rights to do the translation. But they insisted that the translator be Russian. Very, very. So it was farmed out to, probably to, I don't know who it was given to, but no, Sorokin actually. But I was brought in because the translation, not surprisingly, was not very idiomatic. Not very good into English, and so my job was to edit it. And it was very obvious when I started looking at it that it had probably been given to Sorokin, who maybe wasn't given very much money for it, and she farmed it out to many other translators because some pages were very good, almost publishable. The accuracy was good. I'm not talking about the accuracy within those pages, but in terms it didn't read that well. But then there are other pages which were just awful from every point of view. So that's another example of why this insistence that an important historical document be as if not trusting a foreign translator to do a good job with it. But what I want to ask is whether the talk was very much on post-Soviet, and that it's suggesting that these trends continue and that there's sort of no escape from them. Do you think that mentality persists? That translation needs to somehow be nationalized, and is that perhaps connected to something deeper? I remember Andrei Zorin was saying that every foreign word, when it arrives in Russian, and is used in Russian. So he's taking the example of the word concept, now used in Russian concept, but he was saying the word concept in Russian is far more conceptual than the word concept in English. The way words, and there's this sort of making foreign culture and foreign concepts one's own. Do you think this is part of the problem? Do you think this nationalizing of translation speaks about something deeper in Russian culture?
For one thing, Russian culture as a whole, in all its aspects, including politics, is a European culture which lags behind the Western European paradigm. So this happens in literature, this happens in translation, this happens in many fields, and this is one of the reasons, answering your previous comment, why there are so many translated books in Russian bookshops, because it's still a major part of our culture and of our history, and we still have to catch up. I think that what was your data, that there are something like 30% of all titles are
15% of all titles are translated,
but that
and
includes
90% of those are from English.
Yes.
From English?
Yes, 90% of translated literature is translated from English. So we are very much.
Is that for Russia?
Yes.
Yes.
But I wouldn't stress the backwardness. I mean, if you go into a bookstore in Italy, there's a huge translated section, whereas in France there's none. It's a question of countries being receptive.
Of course.
Yes,
that too.
Yeah.
Here in this country, hardly any.
Yeah.
And United States.
Yes. And I think there is some kind of dynamics of national culture being expanding to wider and wider circles of users, so to say, like it was the case, for example, in the second half of the 19th century with all those narodniks and everything else. And immediately after the revolution, of course, which was an unprecedented growth of people who now were literate and who wanted to come closer to the wealth of world culture, and times of contracting and of going deeper and of narrowing down.
And then nationalization is not so important when you go narrow ways.
And I think that now we're perhaps in the beginning of this cycle when culture is becoming more insular and more elitist. And perhaps there is a chance. There are bad things about that, of course, but the good thing is that perhaps we can really go deeper and try to bring translation closer to the original, so to say.
We still have a few more questions. I've been keeping you waiting for a while.
Yeah, I've got two questions actually. The first one, sort of referring back to the drunken communists at Progress, I was just wondering, you were mostly obviously speaking of Russian literature as receptor of translations. I was just wondering if you've done any research as how translations were done in Soviet Union and how they are done now, sort of from the point of Russian being the source language rather than target.
We actually, one of our students, the diploma paper.
Sorry, I'm just to make sure that we understand. Are you asking about translations specifically done in Russia, or just translations of Russian literature done anywhere?
Done in Russia, I think.
Well then.
Well, if you want to comment on that one, if that's
no,
I think that this trend of Raduga and Progress that was very active in Soviet times isn't there anymore, because there is no.
People just don't do it.
Yeah,
anymore.
There is no money in it because it was funded by the party and by the state, of course, as propaganda, and we've just.
It was a very artificial thing, because obviously the translations are done in the target culture, because people translate what they need. They go to the other culture and take what they need and translate it. And when it's done inside source culture, it's propaganda thing.
And it's imposed. And there are sometimes good things coming out of it, because just recently we talked to an Indian-British author, Neil Mukherjee, who told that he was growing up in Calcutta, in which was a communist state within India, in a sense. And there were lots and lots of English language books done by Progress. And so he read, for example, Ivan Bunin, among other things. So there was propaganda aimed at promoting Russian culture, not just Soviet values. But I think that it's not there anymore, and anything
it just doesn't exist.
Yeah, or if it exists, it's.
But interestingly, translations of Master and Margarita, for example, done in the West, tend to become more and more precise and. Exactly in the same way, when cultures come closer, there is need for more precise translation, not generalizing things, not changing them, but probably coming closer to the culture. So it goes both ways.
The second question?
Yeah, and I was just wondering, you were talking about the sacred cows, and sort of one obvious sacred cow was obviously Samuel Marshak. And I was just wondering what you think about his legacy, and you sort of mentioned Gasparov working and sort of revising some of the literary translator's legacy, and Marshak kind of being part of that legacy. And to my mind, Marshak did a lot of translations that were sort of, literary, or what they would call svobodny перевод. But that sort of made Robert Burns in his translations immensely popular. So I'm just wondering, and also sorry, it's a badly formulated question. In English translation studies, the discourse is that this kind of loose translations are quite popular, and whenever there are translations, people would normally comment on how easily it reads. So I'm just wondering whether you think that was part of the general trend, rather than being, particularly Soviet kind of literature for
everybody. Of course, it's general trait that the looser translation is the more popular it can become, because foreignizing literalist difficult translations are extremely unpopular and only aimed at certain people who want to go deeper.
Not always.
Well, not always.
Pavir and Bolokonsky are very literate.
Yes, that's paradoxical example, but yes. But still, yes, of course it's general trade, but probably Soviet Union with those immense print runs and this target audience of all workers and peasants made it overall principle and fought all other types of translation violently. I think that in normal situation, yes, of course, looser translations normally will be more popular, but nobody would fight with such vigor any other method.
And then again, when we...
They can coexist. Like there are, 10 translations of Vaina и мир. And in Russia it was very rare. Normally there would be one translation, the translation, our Salinger or our Vonnegut, and that's it.
Yeah. And then when we speak about translation of poetry, it's so much harder to say what is good and what is not, and what is going to be a good translation and what's not, because there are some other poetic things at work which are very undefinable, because there are loose translations by Marshak which are very popular, and rather loose translations rather strict translations by Gileskul from Lorca,
which are also
popular.
And so, by the way, we think that Marshak is a genius, but he's a genius of certain type of translation.
And basically Gasparov's idea was that it was one of the ways to translate it, a hugely successful, something that made Shakespeare's sonnets available to a huge audience, and Robert Burns, of course, and so on. And it was an achievement, not a mean achievement.
The paradox was that his article was very complimentary to Marshak, but it contained analysis, and analysis was not, was not what you applied to sacred cows.
And the idea that there were other ways to do that, it was sacrilegious.
We're kind of running out of time, but Jerry, give you the
last word. Absolutely, what you were just saying came right round back to what I was going to say. I was delighted to hear you mention Mikhail Leonovich Gasparov among the pantheon of theorists of translation. I translated one of his books into English, and he translated one of mine into Russian. And one day maybe I'll publish the correspondence between us about doing this.
Sorry, which book did you translate?
Очерк истории европейского стиха.
Well, can I relate a small anecdote, because I think it's something that you might be interested in. I was once in company with Mikhail Leonovich, and he was telling about the English translation of this book, and he said, "Well, I received a letter from my English translator."
That's me.
Yes, so he received a letter from you, detailing several questions and asking making some suggestions and corrections and so on and so forth. And my first thought was, he should have written this book.
No, that's not me. That's not me. The person who wrote that letter is Lear Frank Halford Stevens, who's just retired as an editor with Oxford University Press.
Oh, I see.
And when I wrote my obituary of Gasparov, I said that Lear Frank is the only person who knew more than Leonovich. But Gasparov did write that sentence to me. This is the man who should have written the book. Anyway, that's by the by. What I wanted to say is this: of course, you were talking mainly about the translation of prose and not really the translation of poetry, except for Marshak. Also with Gasparov, I had a long correspondence with him about Marshak, and what was really going on then was he asked me who's best, Marshak or Pasternak, which is the best translation of the sonnet. So this was something that interested him, but what he really wanted to say, and of course couldn't explicitly at the time, he was wanting to say something about what you just said about how the Soviet official theory of translation got instituted in the 1930s and how inextricable it was from Stalinist ideas of Kocha and all the rest of it. But of course he was never able to say this. But it's in some of his correspondence. Anyway, just one other footnote about him. Besides the things that you said about him, I think that the most interesting thing that he ever did as a practical translator was not to do with the classics, but his retranslations of existing translations of Russian poems.
Yes.
Yes.
Those
Yes.
were really,
Yes. Well, actually,
which in an inexplicit way blew up the entire tradition of official Soviet formal translation.
absolutely. I mean, what was so amazing about Mikhail Leonovich was that he could be extremely, he would be a stickler for precision and everything, and he even claimed that he only once translated poems with rhymes, because rhyme distorts, yes. But on the other hand, he did some wild experiments in the field of translation.
Like nobody else.
Like he translated the whole Orlando Furioso by Ariosto in free verse.
Yeah.
And he translated, he made so-called the conspect translations,
That's right. This
which
is what
were
I was talking
yes, which were translations of
summary translations.
summary translations, yes, which were shortened sometimes 4 times compared with the original, and these translations included reworkings of Pushkin and Lermontov and Baratynsky, and which brought them into a completely different 20th century idiom, and basically there was a very bold attempt of divorcing form and matter, which for him as a scholar or a scientist, because in Russian it's the same word, and I'm sure that Gasparov was very keen being ученый, just like a mathematician or a physicist, which was very interesting for him as a scholar. So.
We need to start thinking about dinner. We've been talking about translation for an hour and a half. We haven't even mentioned Alexei Tsvetkov's new translation of Hamlet, which looks extremely interesting, and that, of course, is the sacred cow of sacred cows.
Oh, yes.
And also Alexei Tsvetkov's self-translations. That's, I think, the most interesting thing.
Well, the Hamlet looked pretty good to me from a cursory glance, and it seemed very sonorous.
And he's now working on King Lear.
Right, right. And talking about poetry, which I'm sure you'll agree has been underrepresented so far in this series. The last seminar next week is all about, it's about poetry in post-Soviet Russia, but specifically about redefining the canon of Russian poetry since 1991. So I hope you'll come to the last seminar next week. So it just remains to thank you both once again for extremely knowledgeable talk.